Hi, welcome back to ThoughtSmith U.S. History Edition. I'm Mr. Smith, and today we're going to be talking about the North during the 19th century as well as the Industrial Revolution. Now, we've covered a few different topics in the past couple weeks, from conspiracy theories to vaccines and also the Industrial Revolution and how children were affected and different groups were affected by the changes in technology and the changes in industry. These changes are going to come into play in the next couple of weeks as we dive into the Civil War. So we really need to understand how the Industrial Revolution changed and modified the North and into a completely different place than the South, because we had two different cultures essentially living right next to each other. And when cultures come into contact with each other, there's usually violence. So today we're going to be checking out the Industrial Revolution and how that changes the North in the 19th century and technology in general. So I hope that you guys like it. Here we go. All right, so we are here with Beverly Wood. Beverly Wood is currently working on her master's degree in medical physiology, specifically with respiratory systems. Before that, she was summa cum laude from San Francisco State in California. I believe it was literature of some sort?
English literature.
English literature, okay. So this is one of my good friends. She is very talented. She is very intelligent. And I thought that this would be a great time for us to get together and explore technology and how technology is kind of changing, how technology has changed culture in the past, and how we might view technology in our own lives right now. So we're going to organize this around 4 different questions. The first question is going to be, how can tech be a vehicle for cultural change or cultural ideas? The second question, we're going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution and how it reflects that change. And then we're going to look at how opportunities are affected by technology. And last, we're going to try and connect this to our personal lives. So we're going to be looking at how technology continues to change and how that continues to change our culture, how we operate as people, and kind of how it impacts us as individuals and as a society. Okay, so let's just jump into that first question. How can technology be kind of like this vehicle for cultural change or cultural ideas?
Right. Well, I mean, even as recently as my own childhood, I think that technology has changed just incredibly. Having like a single corded landline and having to like beat your brothers and sisters to get there to see who was on the phone. Whereas now it's incredibly common for even children to have their own cell phones, which are touchscreen, which was not a thing before. And just like the different sort of social norms that come with that are really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the idea of like an address book that's basically in your cell phone, like you have contacts. You don't even need to memorize people's numbers anymore. And I mean, caller ID, you can see who's calling you and you can choose to ignore it or to accept it. When before it's like the phone just rang, you're like, hi, Rockwell residence, you know?
Rockwell residence, yeah.
So yeah, it kind of alters the way that we live our lives. And that is especially true in terms of history. So when we're thinking about history, we're thinking about things that happened in the past, but how different actors or different ideas have impacted those people and how those have then kind of gone over time and impacted us. So when we're thinking about history and technology, technology kind of had this huge boom back in the 18th century and in the 19th century. In the 19th century, we called that the Industrial Revolution. So you created a really great infographic. We're going to go ahead and pull that up. And we're going to kind of talk through how the Industrial Revolution kind of encapsulates or reflects this idea that technology changes culture and changes the way that we live. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up now. So can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So, how do you think the Industrial Revolution may reflect this change? What was going on in the North, and what is the Industrial Revolution?
Right, okay. So the Industrial Revolution was basically a transition from the sort of previous agricultural type society and economy into sort of a more industrial or technologically advanced society. So this primarily happened in the northern part of the US, like New England area, whereas the South kind of held on to this agricultural society. And in the meantime, it also changed the economies really drastically. The North was starting to get a lot more funding and income, whereas the South was kind of remaining the same. And it even decreased a little because a lot of people from the South actually ended up moving to more like the cities in the North instead of staying in a rural South because they could make more money in the North. So that also caused more tension, which is really important when you look at what happens later in the Civil War and after.
So the Industrial Revolution really kind of like changes the dynamic between the North and the South, because what you get is a factory-based system up in the North where people are working for wages instead of a place to live. And that's a really key distinction between the slave economy and the Northern economy. Northern economy, people work for their wages, and critics in the South who were slave owners would often say, well, my slaves are more free than you, depending on how you define freedom, because you're just a slave to your working hours, to your wages, because you can't live without your wages. Whereas in the
Right.
South, they're like, my slaves don't have to worry about that. I provide everything for them. So
Right.
That becomes a very key distinction in terms of economics.
Definitely.
So thinking about how this is changing the way in which we're operating, what types of opportunities are then afforded to different groups?
Right. Well, something that's interesting, there's sort of like a dichotomy between like the opportunities that were available to previously marginalized groups. For example, these huge factories that were built created like vastly more jobs than were previously available. So groups that might not have been able to get a job as easily before were now like in demand. So people like, like women or racial, like non-white racial groups, immigrants, even children were able to get jobs in factories, which kind of afforded them a little bit of social freedom and economic freedom that they were not afforded previously.
Mm-hmm.
However, because working conditions were atrocious and there weren't any like labor laws to protect the workers at that time. So
Yeah.
yeah, they were pretty horrible. So it's kind of like this idea is like, yeah, they now had money and they had jobs, which is great, but at what cost?
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a shout out back to one of my previous videos, the women's movement, because at the same time the Industrial Revolution is happening, the Age of Revolution is happening. It's not just in technology, it's also in these social trends. And women want a public life that is equal to that of a man. But when they start going into factories, it's just glaringly obvious that women are not socially equal. They're not publicly equal. And that becomes a really, really big sticking point as we move into voting rights and suffrage, because they're like, look, we can't even vote to improve our lives in this area. We can't have wage laws for us because we're not even represented in the electoral system. We can't even cast a vote, you know?
It was also excessively common during that time period for a young woman to have a job, and then as soon as she got married, to quit her job because her most important role was to be a mother, not to be a worker, not to contribute to society in that way. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really, I think, in order to get into the mindset of like how women were treated during that time period, you should think about that, because they weren't looking at a woman as like at her ability to contribute to society. they were looking at her ability to contribute as a mother. So, like, it's interesting.
Yeah, and that limited capacity for women is a big sticking point in our current society. Because back then there's the idea of Republican motherhood, where women were expected to be great, phenomenal, educated mothers, so they could raise the next generation to be, educated and have that idea of infinitely perfectible, that kind of like liberal idea where you can infinitely perfect yourself, and mothers were expected to kind of transmit that socially. But what that does is it relegates them to a very specific job in society rather than letting them do whatever they want. They were no longer individuals, they were merely products of a society. And that's the opposite of what men were treated like. They're like, go out, fulfill your dreams, but you're a woman, you get to stay home and just do this because that's your job. All right. So the last question is, how does tech continue to change today, and how does it really impact our lives?
Right. Well, I think you can even see that in the recent pandemic and the way that schools are being forced to, move everything online, even with my own classes and with the people who are going to be watching this video. It's definitely a different learning environment. However, if this pandemic had happened even like 10 or 15 years previously, it would have been like a full stop in the educational system and a lot of other things like any type of like shopping, that it would have been a full stop, which would have meant like a really huge crisis for our economy, especially.
And I mean, right now, our economy is in kind of crisis mode. I mean, we're about to experience probably the largest recession that we maybe ever had, which is, it's crazy to think about. I didn't think I'd have to go through two this early in my life, but, at least the last time I was very young. And thinking about the idea of like online retail markets and how they're really stepping up to the plate now, because we can't function as if it was, back in January. We have to move forward, and moving forward is having this online infrastructure in our education system and how we purchase goods, and how, I mean, not just goods like a computer part being shipped in, but think about like shipments from China, right?
Yeah.
Where those have been drastically impacted by this, and global supply chains, which is a supply chain is like one person produces over in this country, and then that goes to Indonesia and gets built here, and then and then sent over to another country, and everything is kind of has a very particular supply chain. And when it gets to the United States, it's a complete product, but those parts of that product were picked up along the way and made in different places. And those have been massively disrupted. But yeah, I mean, COVID-19 has kind of fundamentally changed the way we operate and how we live our lives. And it's going to continue to do this for possibly years. So this could be one of those watershed moments,
Yeah, definitely. I just think it's interesting to think about what would have happened if this pandemic had occurred, like even in our own childhood, or like, even 100 years ago, or like before that, like what the different sort of regulators would have been, or modulators would have been in this type of crisis previously. Whereas now we have all of this technology, which is effectively helping,
Yeah. It's initially, it felt like kind of like a stopgap measure. It's just like, oh, we're just throwing in this e-learning stuff. We're just throwing in this just to kind of sure up the holes or give them at least something. But it's actually, I mean, I'm able to now make these videos for my students, and it's not as if it's equal to education in person, but it's definitely a lot better than if this were to happen, let's say in 2004. We can go back to Hurricane Katrina. Children were out of school for like half a year. without anything because they didn't have homes, they didn't have schools, they didn't have anything. They had to go outside of their communities and move hundreds of miles away just to have a somewhat normal life. And this technology that we have now has definitely changed that, at least made it a little easier.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to go ahead and end it there.